Hello, I'm Harvey Ambrose, and I am bringing this message tonight on behalf of the Missionary Baptist Voice of Africa radio program that is broadcast out of Monrovia, Liberia. And continuing in our study of the book of Genesis, we are in chapter 46 and verse 1. Genesis 46 and verse 1. And Israel took his journey with all that he had, and he came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. And Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. And Jacob rose up from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, and their little ones, and their wives, in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their cattle and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt. Jacob and all his seed with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him into Egypt. And these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt: Jacob and his sons, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn. The sons of Reuben, Hanok, and Phalu, and Hezron, and Carmi. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel, and Jamin, and Ohad, and Jachin, and Zohar, and Sheul, the son of a Canaanitish woman. And the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And the sons of Judah, and Onan, and Shelah, and Pharez, and Zerah. But and Onan died in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Pharez were Hezron and Hamuel. And the sons of Issachar, Tola, and Puvah, and Job, and Shimron. And the sons of Zebulun, Zebulun, Sered, and Elon, and Yaleel. These be the sons of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob in Padan Aram, with his daughter Dinah. All the souls of his sons and his daughters were 33. Verse 16. And the sons of Gad, Ziphon, and Haggai, and Shunai, and Esbon, and Eri, and Erodai, and Areli. And the sons of Asher, Jimnah, and Ishua, and Ezui, and Beriah, and Serah their sister. And the sons of Beriah, Heber, and Malchiel. These are the sons of Zilpah, whom Laban gave to Leah his daughter, and these she bare unto Jacob, even 16 souls. The sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife, Joseph and Benjamin. And unto Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, which Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bare unto him. And the sons of Benjamin were Bela, and Becher, and Ashbel, and Gera, and Naaman, Elhi, and Rosh, Muppin, and Huppin, and Ard. These are the sons of Rachel which were born to Jacob. All the souls were 14. The sons of Dan, Hushim. And the sons of Naphtali, Jaziel and Guni and Jezer and Shillem. These are the sons of Bilhah, which Laban gave unto Rachel his daughter, and she bare these unto Jacob. All the souls were 7. All the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins, besides Jacob's sons' wives, all these souls were 66. And the sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2 souls. All the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. And I'll stop the reading there at the end of verse 27 and acknowledge that my pronunciation of the names is not to be copied. It wasn't very good. So, genealogies are not the easiest thing to read, but to just not read them, which was my temptation, has us pass over some facts that hopefully I will get to. But also, it goes to how we view the Bible, how we view in what regard we hold the Scriptures. If God saw fit to write these people's names in a book, which He makes available for us to read, I guess the question would be, who am I? If I'm trying to preach to you from the book of Genesis, who am I to not try to read them? We may not get much from it, I don't know. But I'm going to read it because God caused Moses to write it. Now, going back though, to the beginning of this chapter, and remembering that the family of Jacob, having been a broken and torn up and fractious family, and problems abounding on the parts of just about everybody involved, except, Joseph had his problems, but he was not the cause of his problems, but all the rest of them were doing things that probably helped bring about the troubles that they had. Nevertheless, the actions of God through Joseph, and doubtless through the Spirit of God, acting on the hearts of the people involved, had brought about a reconciliation of that family, the one with the other, all people reconciled to each other. It was love and harmony, maybe for the first time ever in that great family. And not only that, but they had come into riches in a situation in which the whole land was starving to death. People were about to start selling their land and their animals and even their own selves to Pharaoh throughout that whole region of the world, just in order to have food to eat. Desperate times indeed. And yet, during these desperate times for the rest of the world, God had brought about a blessing upon this family that had been, in a bad way, meaning in their relationships one with another. Yet He had brought about a circumstance in which the ruler of the only nation in that part of the world that had food is in essence begging them to come down and take the best land that there is and live there and enjoy the wealth of the nation over which he was Pharaoh, or king. Now, it's interesting how when God does take an action towards people, when people have turned to God, turned to godly ways, and turned to God Himself with all of our hearts, how He hears the prayers that we have and sees the needs and desires that we have, And I'm not talking about worldly desires. I'm talking about things that matter. Reconciliation with each other, good behavior towards each other, reconciliation with God, and good behavior towards God. When we think rightly and approach God rightly, and He answers us, He answers us just not in those things which we're seeking help with, which is what I just mentioned, that the world can't help with, but only God. But yet when He helps us in that way, it's not unusual for Him to bless us even in the lesser things, which would mean prosperity in this present world of flesh and blood. And the transient world in which we live it won't at all times be, but sometimes when we least expect it, the Lord will pour out a blessing upon those who love Him and who seek Him and who find Him. That might be a lesson that we could take from this, because that's certainly what happened to this family. Once reconciliation had taken place, they had it made, to use the common vernacular here around here. They had it made. Their troubles were over. They went down into Egypt and they lived it rich. They had the fertile ground of Goshen, which was watered by the Nile every year. They had their own cattle down there, which were going to be amazingly increased in number, because they're fed with all that great provender which comes from the ground as God brought it up. They are separated from Egypt because the Egyptians thought of shepherds as shepherding animals is an abomination. And so they, even though they welcomed them into Egypt, both sides were happy that they were separated. The family of Jacob in the land of Goshen, a separate area, the nearest area towards Canaan. And then the rest of Egypt, for the Egyptians, typically on the other side of the Nile, or right at the Nile, in the cities over there. And so they dwelt together, but not, they dwelt in the same region, but they did not mingle with one another, with the exception, I would say, certainly of Joseph and his family, because Joseph was second in Egypt, only to Pharaoh. He was the prime minister or governor, as the Bible calls it here, of all the land of Egypt. He was still responsible for seeing that people survived 5 more years of hard famine in which nothing was grown anywhere. All that was left was what had been laid up in store for 7 years by Joseph during times of plenty. And through the revelation that God made through a dream to Pharaoh, which He enabled Joseph to understand, all these provisions for the saving of life, keeping men and women and animals alive, God had provided for that, even though in His wisdom, for reasons we don't understand, He had allowed drought to happen in that region. He moves in mysterious ways to do things that we don't understand, nor are we necessarily in need of understanding. If we trust that God rules in the affairs of men, that God controls the climate of this planet, that God is the one that's in charge of when it began and when it will end, and the circumstances of both its end and beginning and all those things, if He's in charge of that, when He says that time's going to continue until the last day, and that throughout that period, seed time and harvest will remain, morning and evening will remain, it will. It will. If He says it will, it will. And we can have all the scientists of the world talk about global this and global that, and sickness this and pestilence that, and famine this and war that, and there's always people trying to disturb our hearts. But God controls in this world. Men mess things up, but when He's needed to, He will unravel the problems. That is, God will. And that is the case that's happened here to this family. They've become reconciled. I'm sure through actions of God to one another, and now God is pleased to bless them, in a sense, with a salvation. I'm not talking about salvation of the soul, even though I do believe some of them had that. I believe they were saved. I won't say all of them, I don't know. I think certainly Joseph was. I think certainly Jacob was. I don't know about the rest. But the Bible indicates those two had a close relationship with God. And we see that here at the beginning of chapter 46, because Israel, that's the name that God gave Jacob after he wrestled with him at Peniel and blessed him. He took his journey, meaning he was heading down from where he lived, which was up around Hebron, and he went down to Beersheba. And Beersheba is where his father and his grandfather had lived for many years. It was considered to be the name Beersheba. I think it means the well of the oath. There was a well that was there that Abraham had dug, and yet it was contested between Abraham and a man that lived there locally named Abimelech. And Abraham said, "I dug the well, and I'll prove it. I'll give you these animals as proof that I'm genuine, but I dug the well, and let's have peace." And they did. They swore an oath concerning the well that it belonged to Abraham and that Abraham was not at fault, despite what the herdsman of Abimelech had falsely claimed. So the well of the oath, or in Hebrew, Beersheba, is where Abraham had dwelt for many years. He had raised Isaac there and maybe other places as they sojourned in the land. But Jacob doubtless remembers, and I think it was there at Beersheba or near there where Jacob had grown up. My memory may be failing me, but he's heading there because it's on the way to Egypt, and it's as far south in Canaan as you could go at the time, and there'd still be any place to live. So he gets there, and he brings everybody with him. And it says the first thing he did when he came to Beersheba was to offer sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. Now it's his God too, but he had a thought, no doubt, to Isaac, who, because he had spent time there as a younger man with Isaac and even with Abraham. And God spake, it says, unto Israel, meaning unto Jacob, in visions of the night. So Jacob, for his part, even though it had been made clear by Joseph that everything was okay, that Joseph was still alive, that he was ruler over Egypt, and that he and his whole family could go down there and live it rich, and everything would be wonderful. And he believed that, and he immediately said, I'm going to go see him. I'm going to go see my son, because he lives, and I believe that he lives, and I'm going to go see him before I die. That's where we left off with chapter 45. So he takes the journey, but when he gets to Beersheba, I'm not saying he had second thoughts, but he remembered that we should not always make decisions at the spur of the moment, based upon good news or bad. We should think about it, and then we should pray about it. And when Israel, Jacob, got to Beersheba, he made offerings unto God, because he did not want to be found to having been making a major life decision without consulting God. We don't read that he consulted God after he heard about Joseph and said, I'm going to go see him before I die. So he took off, but now he's thinking, I better talk to God. Isaac had been told by God during a famine in that very land of Canaan, he said, don't go into Egypt. I'll take care of you. Don't you go into Egypt. And Isaac didn't go. He obeyed God. Maybe Jacob remembered that. God didn't want my father to go into Egypt. He may not want me to go in. I haven't asked him. So I'm going to make my offerings unto God, thanking him for all the good that he's done me my whole life. And Jacob would surely tell you that he had. And I'm going to, and we don't know what his prayers were, but I'm sure that they involved this move, because he was an old man. He was 130 years old at this point. and he was relocating. He never had a thought other than live and die in the land of Canaan, his homeland. That's where he'd been as a boy. He was born there. He had to go see Laban for a while when he was in trouble with his brother Esau, but he longed to go back home to Canaan. And he got back to Canaan and raised a big family, and things were going well. And then this famine came, and all of a sudden, he's removing. Now, I can personally tell you that as you get older, it's hard to pick up and move. I mean, I've had to do it. In the past, I guess, 3 years, I have moved. I've moved twice, lived in 3 separate places, separated each one of them by thousands of miles from each other. And I really didn't want to move from the first one or the second one, but I did, because I felt the Lord was having me move, at least on this last one. And you're leaving what's comfortable. And old men, they like comfort. They're tired they don't have the strength they used to have. And they're fearful of things because they don't have the strength, the physical strength, or maybe even the emotional strength to deal with trouble in their old age. And perhaps that was, Israel 130 years old. It's like, yeah, he really needs the Lord's help. He needs the Lord's direction. He makes a sacrifice, and God speaks to him in visions of the night. So he heard the voice of God. God still talks to people. I've never just sat down and have a conversation with him, but he has certainly spoken to me. It's a rare thing. It's when I need it most, when I need it desperately, when the Lord will actually get down to the point of speaking. Very few times. There's other times where, short of speech, he has greatly blessed my heart and let me know that everything was okay. Everything was going to be okay. Or given me direction. Move here. Don't move there. Both of those have happened. It's one of the reasons I've moved so much. But yet, in the midst of it, when he comes and the trouble that we have in our hearts, when we don't know what to do in a world that has become frightening to us because of a change of circumstances that we had not anticipated. And we had grown comfortable in our old age sometimes. And young people also are fearful of moving, leaving sometimes family behind, but certainly friends and occupations, leaving and going, not just moving, but moving to another nation is what was going on here, to a people that they don't know, who had not treated Abraham all that well. And perhaps Jacob also remembered what God had told Abraham himself. I don't think he mentioned Egypt, but back in Genesis 15, God spoke to Abraham, so the grandfather of Jacob, or Israel. He said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed, and that includes Jacob, shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they serve will I judge, and thereafterward shall they come out with great substance. Maybe he's thinking, am I the instrument whereby my family is brought into a land where they're going to be made to serve? It means made slaves, is what it means. He had never been a slave. He had served Laban, and that was hard enough. And Laban was a relative. But men are hard to work for. They're not always just. Certainly being a slave would be hard, and Jacob perhaps remembered what Abraham had doubtless told concerning God's promise and prophecy of what's going to happen to his descendants. So anyway, he makes his concerns known to God, and he offers the appropriate sacrifices, whatever they were. And God answers him, and he calls him by name. It says, Jacob. Jacob. It's like he's having to wake him up or something. I don't know if he was asleep or not. It was a night vision. But somehow, he let him know, without a doubt, that it's God. And then he says, I'm God. The God of your father. You came in here to the town of your father, and you made offerings to the God of your father. Well, I'm the God of your father. I've seen your offerings, and I've heard the meditations of your heart. I know what's in your heart. I know your concerns. You're wanting to know if it'll be okay. Isn't that what we all want to know? If we could just tell the future, we would know what was going to happen. Of course, I think if some of us knew our future, we would not want to know. It all depends on what our future is. A lot of people would be very fearful if they knew for a fact what was going to happen to them. And some of us whom God has greatly blessed have had things happen, but if we had known in advance, we would have wished ourselves to have died before we had such news come to us. It'd be preferable. But in this case, it was a good thing. He said, I'm the God of your father. And he answers the questions that had to be on his heart. He says, fear not to go down into Egypt. In other words, don't worry about it. That means it's going to be okay. Have no fears in that regard. Fear not to go. And then he explains what's going to happen. For I will there, meaning in that land of Egypt, make of thee, meaning Jacob's family, a great nation. Now, Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, had been promised by God that he would make out of Abraham's seed a great nation, and that through Abraham's seed, it means a singular one, Christ, all nations of the world would be blessed. Well, now, here's, according to the King James, 70 souls going down. It's not accurate, but we can get to that if we get to where it talks about it. It should be 75, and I can tell you why if the time comes. But that's a pretty good-sized family, but that's no nation. Nations are many thousands of people, and much produce and much animals and much abundance are in nations of people. And he said, I'm going to make of you a great nation there in Egypt. Now, it's hard for them to get great in a land that is not highly productive. They live, we would call it here paycheck to paycheck. I'd say they'd live here in Canaan from one field of grazing to another, and they slowly grow up in wealth, but how can they greatly populate if they don't have an abundant supply of food? How can they become a great, populous, wealthy nation? Except in a great, wealthy country with an incredible amount of pasture for their animals, and the convenience and comfort of what normally is a good, abundant lifestyle. Even though right now, even Egypt is in a famine for the next 5 years. So he says, that's the place where I'm going to fulfill what I told Abraham. I'm going to make his family, which is you, Jacob, and your family, into a great nation in that place, Egypt, where you're going. And more than that, so it's two things. I'm God. He's God, and there's two things. Don't be afraid of going down to Egypt. Number two, that's where I'm going to turn you into a great nation. So God's going to make it to be a good thing. And then he says, I will go down with thee into Egypt. He's saying, you can go to Egypt. And he tells us we go to the ends of the world and we will not separate ourselves from God. See, God he's everywhere. And the people whom he has saved, they know that because they have found him a ready comforter of their hearts in all places where they go. And this is what Jacob is learning. He says, I'll go with thee. God does. He said, I'm going to go with you to Egypt. And then he says, and I will also surely, and when God says he's surely going to do something, you can bet on it. I will also surely bring thee up again. He's saying, you're coming back. You're coming back to this place that has been your home. all your life, the place you've always wanted to live. You never wanted anything more than the life you've had. We never read that. Now Jacob did covet. He coveted his brother's birthright. He's coveted his brother's blessing, and he connived with his mother in order to get those things. It wasn't a right thing to do, but he got what he wanted. But with those two things, he was content. He did love Rachel. He finally got her, but it sure cost him a lot of work. And it caused a lot of animosity between his offspring through Rachel and his offspring through his other wife and the concubines of these two women. So, not concubines, but maidservants. And so, but for the most part, Jacob's just happy to be a homebody. He just wants to be home. And he says, I'm going to bring you home. You don't worry about going down there. Good things are going to happen. I'll make you into a great nation. I'm going to go with you. And if I'm going with you, yeah, I guarantee you, you're coming back here. And of course, that's exactly what happens. He comes back dead. He dies in Egypt. And he refers to that. He says, and Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. It's just an expression, when people die, they, movies always show it that their eyes close. But typically they don't. If they're not closed when they die, they're wide open, and even after they die. And so someone has to close the eyelids. Typically, it's a friend or a relative, and he's telling him, Joseph, the most favorite person you got left, Jacob, the one you love above all people on earth, he's the one. He's going to be with you when you die. He'll close your eyes, and you're going to be brought back here. And that's, of course, exactly what happens. God never lies. He never lies to us. When he tells us, the things that he does, let us reason together. Even though your sins are like scarlet, I'll make them white as snow. Even though they be, like crimson, I'll make them white as wool. I'm going to forgive you. If you'll come to me with all your heart, with a broken and contrite spirit, I'll save you. I'll forgive your sins. I'll forget your sins. I'll wash them away. I'll separate them from you as far as the east is from the west. He doesn't say, well, wait a minute, no, not yours. I'm not going to forgive that sin. Now, people think that, but that's not what he says. He says in another place, Jesus said, all sin and blasphemy is forgiven unto men. There's nothing you can do that's not forgivable. You can bet that if you go with all your heart to God, looking for forgiveness, looking for life, when you feel like the heart that within you just died, that the whole world has become dead to you, and all you really want is to hear a word from God, a word of forgiveness, a word of love, a word of assurance that everything's going to be okay. He does that. He does it to this very day. He doesn't change. He does it for all of his people. He does it for those who are not yet his people. But those who are seeking, he abides by exactly what he says. And he does that, of course, here. So it says, upon hearing all those things, Jacob rose. He rose up from Beersheba, the well of the oath. And it says, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father and their little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their cattle, their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Egypt. They were, Pharaoh said, leave all your stuff. We got plenty down here. But they took it anyway. It's prudent. And came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him. And it explains that he had his sons and his sons' sons and his sons and his daughters and his son's daughters. In other words, he and his grandchildren and probably great-grandchildren, he took them all down into Egypt. And I said that instead of 70, it was 75. Now this King James Bible, it's an excellent translation, one of the best. It is the best commonly available, certainly the best for the New Testament, and the easiest to read of the Old Testament. But it is the King James Version of the Old Testament is from what is called the Masoretic text, which was compiled and written by Jews in like around as late as 1000 AD, so after Christ. So it's a fairly new thing. You know, the Jews had been by that time forsaken of God and cast all over the world, where they still are. They were in bitterness towards Christians. I guess somehow they must have blamed their woes on the followers of our Lord. But in any case, where they could, it seems that they changed things that they should not have changed. They had reasons for it. But this is one of those things. Because where we read to you earlier, where it talks about the sons of Joseph, it clearly states this in, let's see if I can find it, in verse 20. And unto Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, which Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of Onan, bare unto him. So it's clear, it's saying this is it. He had 2 sons. That's all. But that's not true. There's another and much older Hebrew Bible, and we know this because it was there were Hebrew scholars who were familiar with the Greek back some 250 years before Christ, and they were asked to translate the Bible into the Greek language, and they did an excellent job, and it was pronounced to be excellent by the Hebrew rulers at the time. All the great wise men of Israel had looked it over word for word and said it's a perfect translation into Greek. So the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek around 250 BC. That is when Jesus and the apostles quote the Old Testament, which they did all the time. Throughout the New Testament, it's largely quotes from the Old Testament. They were quoting that translation into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. It just means the 70. There were 70 people that translated it. And long story short, it's a better translation of the Old Testament, in my opinion. It doesn't read as easily. It is not as familiar to people. But for places where there's conflict, it's worth looking at the Septuagint to see the very thing that Christ quoted and the apostles quoted and referenced all the time. And there, it says it was 75. And the reason given is that there were other sons that Joseph had. He had those 2 sons, I think maybe one other, or it could just be that those 2 sons, and I know this for a fact, had children, and one of them had grandchildren. So Joseph's sons included both grandsons and grandsons, and that brought the total coming into Egypt altogether from the seed of Jacob to 75. And the Jewish historian, Josephus, who was about 100, well, he was earlier than that, but he wrote what he wrote at about 100 AD. He also references that. And so did another translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Samaritan Pentateuch. We have 3 different old scriptures, all of which say 75, and name those names of those descendants. And that's the case. That's what it was. So it was 70. It doesn't really matter, but it's just something that we should be aware of, is that when something doesn't make sense, or where we wind up with a contradiction, or what seems to be one, there's usually a good answer. And there is apparently a good contradiction. People see a contradiction, but they're wrong when they see it. It's found in Acts, where the martyr, a deacon named Stephen, about to be stoned to death, gave a history of, I think it's Acts chapter 7, gave a history of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, of the Israelite nation. And I believe it's in there where he says that it was 75. Let me see if I can find it really quick. See, I'm still looking. It's in Acts chapter 7. And yeah, here it is. 7:14. Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him. This is Stephen speaking to those who are about to murder him. He says, and all his kindred, 70 souls. That's 70 is 60 plus 15, 75. So Stephen says it's 75. So people today will say, see, the Bible contradicts itself. Stephen says 75. The Old Testament says 70, which is right. Or who are these Christians to think that they don't even know the Bible well enough that they write down wrong numbers? No, it's not a wrong number. It's a right number. And the translators, the King James translators, using the version they had, also translated that right. But the problem was the version they had, given by those Jews, the Masoretic text, had been corrupted, at least in terms of that number. So we'll end it there. God bless you all. Bye-bye.